AI is transforming applications, but with innovation comes new risks. Enter Noma, the first application security platform built to secure the entire data and AI lifecycle. From your AI supply chain to models and runtime, Noma protects it all. With a single platform that integrates seamlessly across your data pipelines, Jupyter Notebooks, ML Ops tools, code, and application SDKs, Noma delivers full lifecycle visibility, security, and compliance. Start securing your data and AI lifecycle at securityweekly.com/Noma. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Scott Norberg about code scanning, finding vuln classes, and finding some help from ChatGPT, which admittedly surprised me a little bit. I am your host, Mike Shima, not here to surprise you, and I'm here with Kalyani Pawar, also not here to surprise you, but we'll see what kind of surprising news we do come up with this week. And I think we'll just start off with some .NET. So Kalyani, you weren't able to join us for my talk with Scott, but with Scott and I, we're talking about .NET vulnerabilities and some code scanning with .NET. And here is an article, admittedly from February 2024. So it's an old article about leaking object refs to exploit HTTP .NET remoting. So far, you're possibly still asleep. I'll try to make something interesting here. The reason I pulled this out was that it also, the CVE related to this, was just posted about CISA's Kev. So here's a vulnerability from over a year ago, still being actively exploited. And I suppose the one thing that I do want to really talk about this is that, it was kind of cool because it talked about parsing. But which is always one of my favorite things, but the key part of it that spoke to me is if you scroll down to the very bottom of the article, it talks about, describing the vulnerability, what it was. You can get an RCE effectively through some information leaks, and let's see, where will I quote this from? In January 2024, so once again, a little bit old, please get up to date and patch everyone out there so you don't get that CISA Kev. But the security updates in January 2024 changed the default behavior. That was the part that I'm like, that's cool, of parsing HTTP headers and no longer overwriting trusted values. So basically, this is like, this vulnerability didn't have to happen if the default was more secure, and everybody just rolled out the default secure version and possibly didn't even need to change anything. So it's one of those things that just makes me think, it's just that long sigh, and I think we're going to have a lot of job security for a while. So I don't know, is that, did I keep you around after having to go back to a year-old vulnerability? What's the oldest vulnerability you've had to deal with so far this month?
I don't even know about oldest anymore. I think calling out, have you noticed this trend though? I feel like last week we were just talking about another vulnerability that was disclosed over, 90 days ago. And then it was also a remote code execution vulnerability. And it was still not fixed. So it keeps bringing me back to what is the calling to fix an issue that's out in the open?
Yes. And keep that thought for a moment, because I want to go through a couple more just simple vulns to talk about. And then we're going to talk about that idea between what I was pointing out is that, look, just flip the default to be more secure versus how much effort does it take? So you're building up some good premonitions here, Kalyani. The other small thing, speaking of last week as well, there is a article from the DoyenSec blog about common OAuth vulnerabilities. And I thought this was just a nice complement to RFC 9700 that we talked about last week, that were the best current practice for OAuth 2.0 security. And as we mentioned, the RFC was a great example of we, as the RFC authors, OAuth 2 community, should update our threat models. We should update and reflect on, we had these RFCs and these standards that, specifications, probably more accurate to say, about OAuth, that some implementers found ambiguous, or implementers chose one aspect of how to handle or redirects, and others chose a different way that just happened to be more vulnerable. So the RFC was basically describing, here's how you all developers can do things better, with the unstated part of, and by the way, when OAuth 2.1 comes out, we're going to try to put this into the spec as well. So it's not just purely developers that have to make these decisions or like follow this checklist or this hardening guide. And the compliment here is, if you were curious about how to attack OAuth, there's just some great pictures and some great walkthrough of this. So, Kalyani, I'm going to be nice this week and not go through yet another top 10 quiz of all the different authentication entries that are out there. But hopefully you haven't been scarred by seeing yet another list of common OAuth vulns now.
Well, one thing that always cars me about OAuth is like all these different flows that they have in there. The implicit flow, and then the authorization flow, and then the flow with the PKCE. All of that always, it's like every time I'm dealing with this, like I'm reading it for the first time. Um, so yeah, um, that's all I have to say about OAuth.
And it's a good point, because it's like, oh wait, which token am I dealing with? Was this an auth token, a refresh token, other tokens? What are the security properties that I'm supposed to preserve for these? And there's another article that's, I think, speaks to that idea of complexity, and that's why I pulled it in. This was actually by Scott Piper from the beginning of this year. We talked to Scott a couple months ago about cloud security, someone who's really well versed and well known within the cloud security community. And this blog post is avoiding mistakes with AWS OIDC integration conditions. And I also wanted to highlight this because when I talk about OAuth, I get a little bit maybe lazy, we could say, or hand wavy about the distinctions between OAuth Classic, OAuth 2.0, and OIDC. But these are all related. Basically, let's call it IAM. And what this article points out is, if you scroll down to the bottom of the table, it spoke to me in that sense of RFC 9700 and the idea that, sure, we can say we have OIDC as AWS supports, but if you have a vendor that you're onboarding and you want to use, how exactly do you configure them? And there's just a ton of inconsistency here. There's mistakes that could expose you to compromise, or things that you don't want to happen when we're talking about authentication. And it just was, I think, a really good example that there's a lot more going on here than just say use OAuth, use OIDC, because the configuration details and interoperability, which was another thing that RFC called out, are not quite correct out of the box, or there's a little bit of subtlety amongst them. So, Kalyani, you're definitely more the cloud security expert than I am. So teach me something here, or share something that I can learn about the takeaway from this.
So, okay, so I feel like there's like two things that this article makes me think. One is it reminds me of the shared responsibility that security is everyone's business, not just like the vendor or the consumer or the provider. It's all of us are taking responsibility for it. And so no matter how much of a robust mechanism I make, for example, no matter how secure my JWTs are, but if I'm just like leaking them out there, that's my fault. That's a me problem. And I can't blame it on JWTs. So the misconfiguration is definitely the piece of cake that belongs to like the security team who is implementing this. And the other thing is, I often see everyone struggling with velocity. And so every time I see a vendor approach which feels a little ambiguous, I feel like it is just adding more confusion to this developer whose plate is full of like implementing different features, and then throw in security in the mix, and then say, oh, this is something that deals with authentication. And then that pressure on that feature suddenly builds up. And then it becomes like, wow, security is so much of extra work. And so those are my two key takeaways from reading the article.
Okay, so I'm going to lean into that, because you made that comment. Is this a me problem or not? We're going to have to further qualify that, Kalyani. Is this a forgivable me problem, or could you be unforgiven by by making that mistake. And here I'm alluding to an article from the National Cybersecurity Center. So this is coming out of the UK, actually, and they're proposing a method to assess forgivable versus unforgivable vulnerabilities. And it's actually an allusion back to a 2007 MITRE paper from Steve Christie, who was talking about, to quote, unforgivable vulnerabilities that are beacons of a systemic disregard for secure development practices. And I would kind of translate that into, why do we have cross-site scripting when we have frameworks like React that make it really easy to avoid that? And the wonderfully famous dangerously set inner HTML function call. Like, that's really obvious that you're not doing the right thing while still giving developers the chance to do something if they need that for an edge case. A similar thing would be SQL injection, prepared statements. I'm stumbling over my words here only because I'm trying to be polite about just why do we still see these today. So those are two examples to talk about that I think are pretty easy to fall into unforgivable. But I wonder, before we get into some of the things that they start calling out as criteria, if I just say unforgivable vuln to you, do you have a short list? What comes to your mind?
Um, Unforgivable, something that is punishable in Kalyani's world is authentication bypass, or just being careless with your secrets, exposing them on a public facing server. I don't know. The list is endless, but like it's unforgivable. And I think the definition of forgivable and unforgivable again differs, organization to organization. Obviously, there are like basics, like you can't have SQL or you can't have stored XSS. That's definitely unforgivable. But something I want to allude to is that everybody's risk appetite differs. Say if it's a secret that nobody cares about, it's something that's used in test, a very stupid test. Okay, fine, leak it. Nobody cares. Um, but if it's something to do with like, can I steal someone's PII? Well, then that is high impact, right? And that I don't think any organization has risk appetite for that kind of one.
No. And I think what you're hitting, though, is the idea that there's the risk appetite, as you described, that's tends to be org specific. I think, as you point out, leaking personal information, likely a no-no across the board. But what this article is trying to point out is that rather than having always that context specific discussion, how could we have more of a shared language and shared criteria across orgs about, should this have happened in the first place? And maybe even in that example that you were giving of, leaking authentication credentials, or I'll broaden it slightly to just say leaking secrets. Did you not have a secrets manager? Like, to me, this article is pointing out things like AWS. We mentioned it already, AWS Secrets Manager. That's actually a pretty solid way to just say, put all of your secrets in there, have APIs, have logging, have access controls for whatever secrets you need to use, rather than coming up with your own. And I think that's kind of what they're getting at here, in the sense that, is there an easier way? Is there already an easy way to do this? Is there an easier way to do this than figuring out, should this be a text file? Should this be an environment variable? Should this be this, or this other thing? And then having that conversation, as I hand wave a bit over, is this easy? What does it mean to be easy? Is this, especially from a developer's perspective, is it easy to use prepared statements? What are the situations where I'm writing SQL and I need to write, or let me not say need, maybe I say I want to write raw SQL because I'm not using any user inputs, or I'm using something that's much more complicated with joins, and who knows, that looks like it's more difficult to do with a prepared statement. And that, to me, I think is a richer conversation when we start to figure out forgivable or unforgivable. But I don't know. Does that, how if I start to change that, what starts then to think about that you start thinking about, in the sense of easy? Does that remain? This was an easy mitigation. Does that still remain subjective, or what are the parts you would pull there?
I think when we say easy, I do want to throw this in the mix too. There's also like security culture that we're talking about, right? Every organization has a different security culture. Everybody cares about security differently. What is an indicator of good security culture is if I, as a security engineer, can come up with a very easy fix for a developer where I can, which is a I think a very startup way to do it is like implement the fix myself. Hey, I fixed it for you. I took something off your plate. I think that would be a good signature. But also, it's a good sign of security culture, but also it's not possible everywhere else. I'm just talking on a small scale here. Maybe not something they would do at Fangs. They would hate me for doing this in the Philippines, for
No,
sure.
well, but what you're and there, one of the as they talk about, there's a section called assessing ease of implementation, and they talk about their phrasing, cost benefit analysis, pretty straightforward, and it's basically paraphrasing what you just said is whether this proposed project, whether this proposed solution, is it worthwhile? Meaning, like, is it something that Kalyani could just go do herself? And it actually addresses fundamentally the vulnerability class rather than just the one example of the bug that got reported through a bug bounty, for example. Answering that that's a different way of just saying security culture and evaluating, here's how we're going to prioritize. And there's the third one of the third criteria they use. They start with cost effectiveness. I think that's pretty straightforward. The third one is talking about an ease impact matrix, which you're just saying, what are the potential strategies we have? How are the ways we could fix this? And how much effort will that take? And to me, this was a great callback to threat modeling. Like this whole article, a method to assess forgivable versus unforgivable, it feels in a way just a different language to apply to threat modeling in the sense of what are you building? What could go wrong? Or maybe we would kind of adjust that to what has been going wrong a lot, meaning what vulnerability classes do we keep hitting over and over again? And what would the third question would be, rather than just what should we do, kind of generic, we'd say, what should we do in this case? Or what's cost effective, or what fits our security culture or our prioritization to invest in fixing this vuln class. And that feels to me something that is very positive way of building an AppSec strategy and AppSec program, something like this around. So those are the reasons that this article really caught my eye and for once made me smile when reading about application security news. I think one of the other things that I'll also mention is we don't, Kalyani, we don't have a motto for Application Security Weekly, but one of them could be, one of the candidates is possibly, why do we bother? And that's what happens when we see these unforgivable vulns. I at least call them dead simple vulns. And the only reason I'm harping on this a little bit is because, let me ask it as a question. Does shaming work, or does shaming in specific ways work? Should we be calling out unforgivable vulns, and does that work in a modern AppSec approach?
No, it does not. Yeah, it does not. Shaming does not, because then it is spoiling the culture, which is the harder part. Building a security culture is like a big, I would say years long effort. And if you just run a blameless postmortem, I think that would be a nicer thing to do, because then that would encourage people to report actual issues rather than being like, oh, security just going to make fun out of me for, I don't know, doing this one thing,
Yeah.
which in my expertise was the right thing to do. But, well, okay, the silver lining is coming up for a fix, with a fix for the problem, right? Rather than being like, oh, but like if you wouldn't have done it that day, we wouldn't be here. That's crying over spilled milk, or whatever that quote is. It's often not a good idea.
Yeah, I think the way I would approach that as well is in the sense of either it depends, or maybe I would, in the spirit of asking threat modeling related kinds of questions, in this sense, forgivable versus unforgivable, I would ask, why did this happen? Meaning, was there a framework that is already available? Was the quote unquote easy path, paved road, guardrail, et cetera, was that already available and was avoided out of ignorance, out of laziness, for that matter, to be judgmental? Was it avoided because of a edge case or something didn't work? For going back to the Amazon like secrets manager example, Was that just not available to them for some reason? Was there a reason that that didn't fit their use case? Those are good questions to ask. And I think the other part would, in the sense of why did this happen, which is a very much a post-mortem question, like you said, is how old is this code? Because we've seen, especially over 2024, the easy joke to make is, are you running a VPN appliance? Because it's like a remote, it's remote access for hackers. It's RCE in a box, basically. And what I still wonder about that is how much of those vulnerabilities that have been discovered recently are actually in code that is 10, 15, almost 20 years old that is just collecting dust. Now, I'm not saying those are unforgivable or forgivable for that matter, but what I'm pointing out is, did you create a unforgivable vuln within the last 2 or 3 years? Or is this just old legacy code that was unforgivable at the time, but has never been revisited? It's legacy code. So trying to put into that nuance, but who knows if nuances are ways to sell podcasts. We'll see. But here, Kalyani, help me out, because we've got some more news articles, and with forgivable and unforgivable on our mind, let's try and go through a worked example. There was a company called Now Secure that went through and said, hey, everybody is talking about this thing called DeepSeek. Let's take a look at their iOS app. And they found some things, and they found 5 broad problems. 1, unencrypted data transmission, weak and hard-coded encryption keys, insecure data storage, extensive data collection and fingerprinting, and data sent to China. So a list of 5. Of those, we could talk about what's forgivable, unforgivable. I think the easy one for me is that first one, unencrypted data transmission. That just feels unforgivable. And the extra reason why is that the app deliberately turned off the default that's available on iOS. They turned off ATS. So ATS, by default, application transport security, is what iOS uses to say, hey, let's just enforce HTTP connections by default. It's why we can use public Wi-Fi these days and not be like, oh, the sky is falling, et cetera, et cetera. But this might be an easy one, but did I convince you that that's an unforgivable vuln, or is there something else there?
Of course it is.
Okay.
Unencrypted data, which is also modifiable on the fly. If that does not scream unforgivable, I don't know what does.
Okay, yeah,
but I
definitely easy mode on that one, huh?
Continuing on the trends of what's unforgivable in Kalyani's court is also like sharing my data with outside of the United States. I reside in the United States. I even pay taxes here. If anybody wanted my data, I would say, okay, maybe I can think of sharing it with you. But sharing it's literally leaving the borders right now. And what caught me on a little annoyed side was that initially when I tried to look up their privacy policy, they didn't have one. And then they scrambled around and put one together. But that still did not have like a clear indication of how I can request my data to be deleted. It's first of all, it's leaving geography. I don't even know where is it going. I don't even know what they're going to do with it. And so it brings me back to this golden rule of do not share any confidential information with any model, be it hosted in whichever geographical location. But yeah, that's unforgivable to me. Imagine all of the organizations out here who have to follow compliance policies or legal frameworks and are not allowed to do it, but just some employees spun up DeepSeek.
And so here's, I'm glad you jumped to that one specifically, because I want to broaden that a little bit, because obviously it's kind of easy to point to DeepSeek. Here's an LLM that's residing in China. Don't give your confidential, data to it. As Kalyani just said, there's the ByteDance connection. So that's the other easy one. Don't use TikTok, everyone is saying. But I want to, without being snarky, do the whataboutism, or just point out that internally, a lot of our data is, within the U.S. is being shared purchased, sold, etc., through privacy policies that are possibly just as opaque but better written than this one on DeepSeek. So it's not excusing what DeepSeek is doing, but it's just broadening and pointing out that, to my mind, AppSec isn't just purely a technical and can't be purely a technical consideration anymore. It's sort of there's a great joke about in the physics world about first assume a spherical cow in a vacuum, as you ask a physicist to do something like talk about meat production, and they say, oh well, here's my abstract model. I don't think AppSec can assume a spherical LLM in a vacuum. It exists within these different geographies. And just this week too, I didn't pull this into the show notes list yet, but the UK was revealed. The UK asking Apple about iCloud data. And basically, we need your access, and that's a little bit of a callback to the U.S. government with a couple of years ago going to Apple and say, we need access to this iPhone. So it's not just one government; there are different governments asking about this, and then the countermeasures here, or I should say maybe the responses, are technical. Apple's done a great job of talking about how they do their private cloud compute, how it's on this. So we're talking about in the specific area of LLMs, Gen AI, to protect your data, Kalyani. But then has to be that legal and policy aspects of how do you push back on this. So thank you for listening to me. I definitely went on a bit longer than expected on that one, but I think it just pointed out that but you hit my soapbox of AppSec has to be just more than a top 10 list of technical items.
It screams job security.
That too. But let's roll through. Let's go some of those potentially fuzzier areas too, because forgivable and unforgivable is a very binary terms, but maybe not a binary decision, or maybe we could walk through to figure out how would we do this. So you skipped down to number 5, data sent to China. Let me go back to number 2, weak and hard-coded encryption keys. Now, again, this one might be also one of those easy ones. This does feel unforgivable to me. They're using triple DES. AES, of course, is the encryption du jour. And it just seems like there are ways of that are easy of just managing secrets. So I don't know. Is there any reason to call that a forgivable one in your mind?
No.
Yeah. No. We're just going to have to, we're going to record that and, just have a short so people can just say, Kalyani gets, what's Kalyani think? No. Let's go into items 3 and 4 now. So insecure data storage. So I'll just quote from their paper. In certain conditions, notably with physical access to an unlocked device, this data can be recovered and leveraged by an attacker. Forgivable, unforgivable.
Unforgivable.
Yeah.
Unforgivable.
So unforgivable. This is, Kalyani speaking truth to power here. For me, this was unhelpfully, I went with a probably. So I think I'm going to, if pressed, I'm going to have to come down on your side with this. The reason that I went with probably is I wanted to focus on that aspect of physical access in an unlocked device, because we do want to talk about risk and the sense of, does iOS and Android, do they provide a way to have better local storage, better secure storage? Spoilers, yes, they do. But it's one of those things of, if the only exploit scenario or the attacker scenario that we're talking about is a user with physical access and the device has to be unlocked, the priority drops a bit for me. If this is something where another application on the phone could read from a read-only log and cookies are being logged, or sensitive data is being logged that another app can read, absolutely, that's a lot easier for me to say unforgivable. So that's why I wanted to throw that qualifier in. So Kalyani, let's let you talk through. Then there is, and this speaks again to, I think, your concerns around privacy. The 4th item was extensive data collection and fingerprinting. Forgivable, unforgivable.
It has fingerprinting in it. It's unforgivable. I feel like all of them seem so, I don't know, so that screams lack of security.
It definitely feels rushed, right? It feels like here is something where they released a model. Honestly, they released the model back in December, and now they've got the app around it, etc. So they're rushing, and it does read like a very early release of a mobile app. The fourth one there again was maybe instead of unforgivable or forgivable, does this sound like only the DeepSeek mobile app has ever done this? Or could we possibly point to a lot of other mobile apps that do a lot of this fingerprinting?
I'm sure. I'm
Yeah.
sure a lot of them do it. Yeah. It's just
Yeah.
that DeepSeek is in the news right now, so they all want to rip it apart.
Yes, and you helped me out with a very rhetorical question, I have to admit. But the point here is, I think, going back to AppSec, and does AppSec work in a vacuum? No. What is your threat model, and what are you focusing on? Is it the idea that you're also defending user privacy rather than just saying, well, our data is encrypted? What about the data just being taken encrypted by the company and resold? What about, does iOS, does Android, how are they restricting fingerprinting of a user? And especially if you start to introduce the idea of fraud and fraud countermeasures, how does that fingerprinting actually make it easier for fraudsters? Because on the one hand, if I am running, if I'm trying to defend myself from bots, or I have a ticketing service, for example, it's a lot more helpful if I could fingerprint that, oh, this is Mike's phone, this is Kalyani's phone, who's a human, who's a person, who's purchased from me before. I'm going to let them jump to the head of the queue versus, oh, here's a random phone that that is very much I fingerprinted and was doing bot, the last year when they were buying Taylor Swift tickets, and I know this is still a bot. That type of fingerprinting would be great because you can just say, cool, here's the, it's the RFC evil bit equivalent of saying this is a bot, and you have that sticky fingerprint. But that quickly erodes privacy. So that to me are the fun things in the about AppSec that I would love to dive into more. So I don't know if that sounds fun to you, or if there's something else that brings to mind.
It only brings to mind, like threat modeling again. Like if they really cared about security, they would have threat modeled all this. And this screams blatant security flaws. And I don't think they care about negative PR on that end either.
Or I love the focus on threat modeling, because that was one, as a callback to Apple's private cloud compute. They published a security paper that describes some of the threat models they considered, including the threat model of themselves as a provider. How could users have trust that Apple themselves don't have access to this data? And that was a very big contrast to the way that Microsoft, for example, rolled out their screenshot as a service. That was just like, we're going to screenshot everything, let you search it with AI, and a very immediate focus on this is just what we're going to do for you, skipping over a bit of does anybody want this, is there value from a product perspective, and not sharing any considerations of did they think about the threat modeling. So yes, I think, Kalyani, you're helpfully reinforcing that there's some threat modeling to do. I'm going to very quickly reinforce a couple more articles just as we have to wrap up here. Black Hat USA 2024 videos are available. I listed 3 ones that I think would be fun to look at, and one in particular, the Project Zero, 10 years of Make Zero Day Hard, I think speaks to that idea of unforgivable and forgivable types of vulns. And then the other link is a little bit of a teaser. The top 10 web hacking techniques of 2024. The list is live. So Portswigger and Company, they all the folks over there, they've collected all the votes. They have the top 10 list, and spoilers again, we're going to talk with James Kettle about that for next week's episode. But with that in mind, Kalyani, do you have a favorite of that top 10 that everyone should go read about?
I do. So anybody, I feel like I'm one of those people who's guilty of using emojis all the time. So there's this one particular one where the goblin emoji gets treated as an empty string in Microsoft SQL. And you can do all kinds of things with it. And so I think that was an interesting one because, like, out of everything, goblin emoji? Seriously?
Bring back Goblin mode. I say this would be amazing. So since we're going to get the emails, Kalyani, what's your favorite emoji? Or at least what's your favorite emoji this week?
Damn, it's just the one where like it's this. Like
There we go.
the one eye. Because I feel like I keep reporting issues and I'm like, guys, I saw something, but I can't unsee it.
This is wonderful. Yep. So Kalyani's still finding those vulns. So that's what we love to hear. Thank you, Kalyani, for walking through the news with me this week. Really enjoyed it.
It was fun.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. And thank you, everyone who was listening to our conversation with Scott as well about .NET security and code scanning. Please do remember to subscribe to the show, share us on the socials, check out the show notes. And speaking of emojis or just things that are fun, check out Unending Desire by Bart Graft. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.